What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Finally, with the haircut, trimmed the beard, and in this relaxed, chill position that some of you guys apparently liked, so let's have a seat, let's have a talk. There are places in history that were never meant to be symbols of conflict, symbols of doom or strategic anxiety. Yet they became exactly that, not because of geography alone, but because of the people who ruled them and the decisions that twist their destiny. Kaliningrad is one of those places, as we all know. A territory that was born from the ashes of the Second World War, stitched together by conquest and transformed by ideology, only to be stranded, betrayed, and abandoned decades later by the very empire that claimed it as a trophy. Today, the region stands as both a reminder and a warning. How triumph can rot into isolation, how victory can collapse into strategic burden, and how supposed centerpiece of power can become an embarrassing liability. It mirrors, literally, Russia's slow and painful decline, step by step, decade after decade. And if you want to understand how Vladimir Putin slowly loses Kaliningrad, you must first understand how Kaliningrad was born in the first place. And how everything that made it special, everything that made it a shining symbol of the Soviet Union's pride, became the cornerstone of its downfall. Let's go back to the 1945, to the moment the ashes settled and the cannons fell silent. The city once called Königsberg was obliterated, carved up another after Nazis' Germany defeat, and then handed over to the Soviet Union as a symbol of conquest. It was renamed Kaliningrad in honor of one of Lenin's revolutionary allies, and in the Soviet imagination, the city became a shining example of communist victory. It was not just land. It was psychological compensation for the suffering of the Great Patriotic War, a piece of Europe planted firmly inside the borders of the new Soviet Empire. But Kaliningrad was something more unique. Unlike most of the Soviet Union, which was deeply isolated behind the Iron Curtain, Kaliningrad had a peculiar privilege. It sat right next to the West. Western radio waves, Western fashion, Western music, Western architecture even. And while propaganda did everything possible to shame capitalism and glorify Soviet industrial labor, the people inside Kaliningrad could see what existed outside. They could feel the alternative reality and experience it. It was not just imaginary. They could literally tune in to Polish radio, German broadcasts, sometimes even Scandinavian news. And while most Soviet citizens lived with a permanently restricted worldview, Kaliningrad residents were breathing a different kind of air. By the 1960s and 1970s, this became even more pronounced. Kaliningrad was rebuilt with Soviet aesthetics, but the foundation beneath every street was still European. It was the only major Soviet city where the remnants of Germany, such as cathedrals, castles, sculptures, and surviving architecture, stood side by side with the brutalist concrete blocks of the Soviet buildings. It was the only place where Soviet citizens could walk streets that once belonged to German philosophers, generals, scientists, and musicians, and not as tourists, but as residents, legal ones. This made Kaliningrad incredibly valuable for propaganda purposes, but incredibly difficult to fully control ideologically. People were more cultured, more curious, more aware. They understood that the Soviet story was not the only story in existence. And then they quietly began to question why their own country was so dark, so closed, so paranoid, while the world on the other side of the Baltic Sea seemed full of opportunity, wealth, and joy. And so how did the Soviet government respond? Well, you might have guessed it. By doubling the military presence, by flooding the region with soldiers and naval fleets, by turning Kaliningrad into the westernmost fortress of the USSR. Strategic harbor, Baltic Fleet headquarters, missile installations, submarine bases, all for the purpose of showing the West that the Soviet bear was still alive and well. But the contradiction was already born. Kaliningrad was both a window to Europe and a cage designed to protect the Soviet illusion from collapsing. The Soviet Union wanted Kaliningrad to be some kind of a showcase of its power, and yet it accidentally became a showcase of everything that the USSR was not. Then came one of the biggest events of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. How did it affect Kaliningrad and its residents? Let's talk about it in our next chapter. Then in 1991, everything changed. Not just ideologies or currencies, but identities. The empire that annexed Kaliningrad ceased to exist literally overnight. Suddenly the region was physically cut off from Russia by newly independent countries. Lithuania to the south, Latvia to the northeast, I guess here, Poland to the west, and Europe pretty much everywhere, Moscow nowhere. For the first time in its existence, Kaliningrad had to face a brutal reality. It was isolated, economically helpless, strategically empty, and politically confused. But something incredible did happen. Freedom. Not real freedom, but political freedom. Not democratic freedom, but freedom of choice at least. Freedom of movement, freedom of exposure. Kaliningrad began trading with Poland and Lithuania, residents traveled across the border daily, markets exploded, European products flooded the streets, jeans, perfume, cologne, electronics, chocolate. For the first time in generations, Kaliningrad began to behave like a European region. It was chaotic time, obviously, yes. Crime, poverty, corruption, hunger, just like everything else in the post-Soviet collapse. But the difference was, Kaliningrad was that it had options at least, options that Rostov, Novosibirsk, Vladivostok or Ufa did not have. People could see that Europe existed, that life could be better, richer, freer. And as Moscow tried to reconstruct a broken economy through privatization, oligarchy and chaos, Kaliningrad residents quietly built something else. A hybrid identity. Not Soviet, not Russian, not European, but something in literally between. Everyone knew why Kaliningrad was so special. The Kremlin knew, NATO knew, Europe knew, but nobody expected that it would eventually become the single most fragile and strategically impossible burden for Russia in the 21st century. But the first cracks appeared as soon as Moscow regained its confidence. Because in Moscow's eyes, Kaliningrad was not a city with European access. It was a military outpost on a foreign soil. And that misunderstanding set the stage for everything that followed. Next were probably the most ambiguous 2 decades of Kaliningrad's history. Russian territory but European mindset. Should we think that way, the residents asked themselves. Should we talk that way? Should we even speak Russian? Work that way? Is it better to immigrate to actual Europe? So many questions and not a single definitive answer. Let's talk about this period of Kaliningrad's history in our next chapter. As Russia entered its chaotic rebirth under Vladimir Putin, something became obvious very fast. Kaliningrad did not behave like the rest of Russia. It did not vote the same way, it did not think the same way, it did not obey the same narratives, nothing. Putin's approval ratings were consistently lower in Kaliningrad than anywhere else in the country. Not dangerously low, but noticeably low, and this is obviously assuming we trust the statistics of the voting elections in Russia. But okay. Because Kaliningrad residents had something most Russians lacked. Perspective. For them, Moscow felt distant, abstract, theatrical, outdated. When the Kremlin celebrated military parades, Kaliningrad residents saw shopping streets in Gdansk. When Moscow launched new patriotic slogans, Kaliningrad scrolled through Lithuanian news websites. When propaganda promised economic miracles, we're gonna be the best, Kaliningrad just compared salaries, simple as that, with a country like Poland, not even US or Canada, just Poland. The region started drifting psychologically. When Putin began centralizing power, censoring the media, destroying independent television, and tightening ideological control, the reaction in Kaliningrad was irritation, not admiration. When the Kremlin glorified Soviet nostalgia, Kaliningrad just quietly rolled their eyes, obviously. When Russian TV channels rewrote history daily, residents watched European documentaries. They could see with their own eyes the difference between propaganda and reality. And then came the war with Georgia in 2008, Putin's crackdown on media in 2010, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Putin's slow transformation into paranoid emperor, basically. Russia's shift into authoritarianism, if you wanna call it professionally. Kaliningrad watched it all unfold and thought, well, these people have lost their minds. But they were still Russians, by passport, by status, by law. They were stuck inside a country whose political direction felt alien to them. They did not want revolution, they did not want rebellion. They simply wanted to live like normal Europeans. But Putin never cared about Kaliningrad's identity. To him, the region was a gun pointed at NATO. To its residents, it was a window looking out of Russia. And that contradiction deepened relentlessly year after year. Then came February 24th, 2022. When Putin invaded Ukraine, everything changed instantly, especially for Kaliningrad. What was once a region with privileged access to Europe suddenly became a territory trapped behind walls it did not build itself. Europe closed its borders, trade collapsed, flights disappeared, and the region that once enjoyed unique opportunities suddenly found itself surrounded, isolated, and suffocating. Kaliningrad became a geopolitical hostage, literally. The region that once traveled freely into Europe suddenly needed special permits just to move goods across Lithuania, a country that was a part of the USSR at some point. Entire industries collapsed overnight. Factories stalled. Tourism immediately died. Shops emptied. European goods vanished. Young people fled. Families packed suitcases. The middle class simply evaporated. Kaliningrad residents were, long story short speaking, just forced into a literal nightmare. They did not support the war. They did not believe the propaganda. They did not even want this future. But they were still Russians. On paper at least. Which means Europeans would never trust them again. And the Kremlin would never forgive them for thinking differently either. Kaliningrad became stuck between two worlds, with no way forward, no way backward, and no way out. And suddenly the great Soviet trophy became Vladimir Putin's greatest liability. Because now Kaliningrad is an exposed, isolated military island, surrounded by NATO on all sides. No supply lines, no friendly neighbors, no strategic flexibility, no secure logistics. Just a vulnerable enclave, filled with people who no longer believe in the Kremlin's future. From the most liberated region to the most trapped one. From Russia's window to Europe to Russia's sealed bunker, I guess. The transformation was finally complete. And so, when we do ask the question, how did Putin lose Kaliningrad, we're not simply questioning a political failure. We're tracing an arc of the collapsing empire. The loss did not happen in a single day. It was decades in the making. From Soviet triumph to post-Soviet chaos, from cautious hope to quiet alienation, from cultural separation to literally total isolation. And now, Kaliningrad stands as a symbol, not of a victory, not of a conquest, not of a pride, but everything that went wrong with Putin's Russia. A region literally punished for its awareness, a city condemned for its curiosity, a population penalized for looking over the border, a place that dreamed of Europe and ended up being imprisoned by Moscow's paranoia. Kaliningrad did not rebel, at least not yet. It did not betray Russia, it did not fight for secession. It simply understood too much, it saw too much, it knew too much. And now it is forced to pay the price. A territory once held up as a proof of power has become a proof of decline. And the tragedy is very simple for them. Putin did not just lose the West. He did not just lose Ukraine. He did not just lose trust. He lost Kaliningrad, long before anyone noticed. And other regions may follow as well. Kaliningrad just faced the obvious outcome of Putin's politics. So could the story of this region can be just the preview for what's coming next? That is the question. Well, there you have it, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support our work and also join our private Telegram group, you can do it by becoming a Patreon member or YouTube channel member. You will instantly get an invite link. We're almost at 30 members there. You can pretty much talk with me directly, send me questions, and I will reply with the video messages, this kind of stuff. So yeah, all the links are down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
All they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.